Whatever determines success within the field of science, there's no arguing that these experiments were successful in proving one thing. There are no depths to the evils humans will commit against one another. If you know of an atrocity that belongs on this list, please tell us about it in the comments below. Number 10. The Stanford Prison Experiment. We're starting with one of the more arguably famous examples on the list, though the references to it as a successful experiment might be pushing it. In the summer of 1971, a professor of psychology by the name of Philip Zimbardo would lead a study at Stanford University. The idea was to create a prison environment in which participants would be placed in different roles as either prisoners or guards. Paid $15 an hour, which is roughly equivalent to 110 United States dollars today, participants were set to live within this brutal environment for a period of 2 weeks. But the experiment ended up only lasting 5. You'll see why soon. The idea was that the experiment would allow professors to study the difference in the balance of power within prisons, as well as learn about antisocial behavior, a note which even led the US Navy to fund the experiment. Over the course of 5 days, prisoners were tortured by the guards, each guard becoming drastically more cruel and vile to their charges. They were psychologically manipulated and abused, given arbitrary tasks and regulations which included management of when they could use the bathroom and where. Humiliation was regular, and by the 3rd day, several prisoners underwent a few breakdowns and were released. On the 5th day of the experiment, Professor Christina Maslach would visit the experiment and immediately demand it cease. The next day, Zimbardo did halt the experiment and offered to pay all participants their full wages. It would later be revealed that the guards only acted in the ways they did under Zimbardo's instruction, which led to the impossibility of the experiment's reproduction and an immediate nationwide review of the ethics in experimentation. Number 9. The Neubauer Separations. Peter Neubauer was a child psychiatrist who immigrated to the US in 1941 from Austria. Initially taking work for the Bellevue Hospital in New York, Neubauer began to work on one of the most vile experiments in his entire career. Attempting to study the differences in twins and triplets, Neubauer oversaw the separation of multiple groups of twins and one set of triplets, overseeing their growth and development into adults. Neubauer never revealed to the twins nor their adoptive parents that they had siblings, and when the twins did learn of this, there was outrage. Numerous biographical stories have been published on this, several twins also unfortunately took their own lives, and the findings of the study have been sealed by Neubauer within Yale University until 2065. Number 8. Project 4.1. In March 1st, 1954, the Marshall Island region known as Bikini Atoll was subjected to nuclear weapons tests led by the United States government and dubbed Castle Bravo. As a result, fallout was carried eastwards, contaminating 23 members of a Japanese fishing vessel and the entire populations of the Rongelap and Utrik atolls. Instead of taking responsibility, the government organized Project 4.1 with the intent of studying the Marshallese victims. Ultimately, 239 Marshallese people were exposed, as well as 28 Americans who were stationed on one of the atolls. Effects included loss of hair, skin damage, lesions, and extreme development of cancer, as well as miscarriages and stillbirths. The US government has never attempted to give compensation for these actions. Number 7. Burke and Hare. 19th and 20th century medical history has had a long and troubled history. As scientists have attempted to better understand the human body, a number of them have taken extreme measures to obtain subjects. One of the more notorious of these involved William Burke and William Hare, two men working out of Edinburgh, Scotland. During a decline in legally supplied cadavers, Hare was lodging a friend who suddenly passed away. Turning to his friend Burke, the two decided to sell the corpse to Robert Knox. As more people lodged at the Hare's house, the two men took the life of a sick woman and sold the body to Knox. They continued their spree until the discovery of Margaret Docherty, their final victim. The two were found guilty and executed, and Knox was exonerated of charges, though whether or not he actually knew how the bodies were retrieved remains an open question. Number 6. Project MKULTRA. Another infamous experiment, MKULTRA began with the intention of developing new drugs for the CIA to use in interrogations. The method in which these experiments were carried out was disgusting, with over 7,000 non-consenting civilians from the US and Canada unknowingly made to participate. Psychoactive drugs were secretly administered to them, as well as the use of electroshock therapy, hypnosis, isolation, and a lot of other forms of abuse and torture that are not great. Anyways, running from 1950 to 1970, it wouldn't be until 1975 when these experiments were brought to light by Frank Church. But as the documents were destroyed by a knee-jerk response to the Watergate scandal in 1973, most of the evidence is largely testimonial. However, in 2001, a large number of documents were discovered and declassified. Number 5. The Monster Study. Another disgusting experiment. The Monster Study was headed by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist working out of the University of Iowa. Johnson's experiment was performed on 22 orphans with the goal of inducing stuttering within the subjects. Effectively, half of the orphans were given positive encouragement during their speech therapy, while the other half were mocked for their speech even if they didn't stutter to begin with. The staff would lie and pretend that the orphans were showing signs of potentially stuttering. The results? Well, it didn't induce stuttering as Johnson had hoped, and most of the subjects became withdrawn and extremely defensive. Who'd have thunk it? Number 4. The Aversion Project. A program developed by Dr. Aubrey Levin in South Africa. The intent of this experiment was to attempt to cure soldiers of their homosexuality. I want to let that one sit for a little bit, let it simmer in your brain. As being gay was banned in the South African military, Levin was free to do as he pleased to his victims, which included chemical castration and compulsion electroshock therapy. There were a grand total of 900 victims of these experiments. Levin got 5 years in prison. I really don't want to talk about this anymore. Number 3. The Tuskegee Study. Conducted between 1932 and 1972, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a racially motivated experiment which used black people exclusively as subjects. Attempting to study syphilis and its effects, a total of 600 men were studied, with 399 being infected with the disease. These men were informed that the experiment would only take 6 months, treated with a number of toxic solutions including arsenic and mercury, and then were administered placebos. It was then extended to 40 years, with the victims never knowing that the disease was one they could spread. Not to mention that they never even knew why the experiment was being done in the first place. These men continued to be subjected to even more drugs and spinal taps, but hey, in 1947 they figured out that penicillin was actually a pretty solid drug that worked on syphilis. So anyways, they just kind of kept going until Peter Buxton blew the whistle on the operation. In the end, most of the subjects died as a result of the experiment, and several legal cases led to a number of settlements from the government, the most famous being Pollard versus the United States. Number 2. The Guatemala Syphilis Study. So nice, they did it twice. Wow, it's almost like there's a trend here or something. Perpetrated by John Charles Cutler, also worked on the Tuskegee Study. This study was initially meant to be inflicted on an Indiana-based prison, but instead moved to Guatemala. Why? Well, it isn't officially stated, but I think we can all probably guess. Subjects were exposed to syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroids, with over 5,000 people having participated and 83 passing away during the experiment. And of course, the US government has never compensated its victims. Number 1. Unit 731. The horrors inflicted by the Imperial Japanese Army were many, but none so great as the ones inflicted by Unit 731. When the complex was built in Pingfang, the initial intent was to build biological weapons, and their test subjects were Chinese civilians, trained to view their victims as non-human and told to refer to them as logs. The experiments that were carried out by 731 led to the deaths of between 200 and 300,000 individuals individuals. Some of the experiments included vivisection, poisoning, weapons testing, frostbite testing, syphilis testing, and also some of the literal worst things I have ever had to read about. The Japanese government has not taken responsibility for this alongside their other numerous war crimes committed during the Second World War, and when victims have asked for compensation, they have been refused on the grounds that their needs were met by international peace treaties. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.